Hello, my little Luxes. Welcome back to another Scary Stories My Father Told Me. And I am your host, Charsie Lux. And today I am sharing a very special Scary Stories episode with you. And what makes this episode so special is the fact that we are celebrating the new year. So happy New Year 2025. It will be here before we even know it. But I decided to celebrate by taking all of the scary stories that I have done throughout this year and putting them together as a collection on here. So please come gather around the campfire with me as I share all of the scary stories from this year.
The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men, and the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and the dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gated of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers, and wielded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the wall on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum, amid the profusions of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances that those who entered, that there was few of the company bold enough to set foot within the precincts at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there yet came another chiming of the clock, and then with the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent reveal. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric lustre. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed, in great part, the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great feat, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what had been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then for a moment all is still and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro, more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture. For the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the stable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the stable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the reveal went whirringly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revealed. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, a murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally just. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask, which concealed the visage, was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved by the mad revelers around. But the murmur had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dappled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon the spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the murmur had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with the rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the murmur, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadows of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now, with acknowledged the presence of the Red Death, he had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
The Damned Thing by Ambrose Bierce. By the light of a tallow candle, which had been placed on one end of a rough table, a man was reading something written in a book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not apparently very legible, for the man sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light upon it. The shadow of the book would then throw into obscurity a half of the room, darkening a number of faces and figures, for besides the reader, 8 other men were present. 7 of them sat against the rough log walls, silent and motionless, and the room being small, not very far from the table. By extending an arm, any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet, his arms at his side. He was dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud, and no one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something to occur. The dead man only was without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in, through the aperture that served for a window, all the ever unfamiliar noises of night in the wilderness, the long nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilly pulsing thrill of tireless insects in trees, strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of day, the drone of great blundering beetles, and all that mysterious chorus of small sounds that seem always to have been but half heard when they had suddenly ceased, as if conscious of an indiscretion. But nothing of all this was noted in that company. Its members were not overmuch addicted to idle interest in matters of no practical importance. That was obvious in every line of their rugged faces, obvious even in the dim light of the single candle. They were evidently men of the vicinity, farmers and woodmen. The person reading was a trifle different. One would have said of him that he was of the world, worldly, albeit there was that in his attire which attested a certain fellowship with the organisms of his environment. His coat would hardly have passed muster in San Francisco. His footgear was not of urban origin, and the hat that lay by him on the floor, he was the only one uncovered, was such that if one had considered it as an article of mere personal adornment, he would have missed its meaning. In countenance, the man was rather prepossessing, with just a hint of sternness, though that he may have assumed or cultivated, as appropriate to one in authority, for he was a coroner. It was by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book in which he was reading. It had been found among the dead man's effects in his cabin, where the inquest was now taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put the book into his breast pocket. At that moment, the door was pushed open and a young man entered. He clearly was not of mountain birth and breeding. He was clad as those who dwell in cities. His clothing was dusty, however, as from travel. He had in fact been riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. No one else greeted him. "We have waited for you," said the coroner. "It is necessary to have done with this business tonight." The young man smiled. "I am sorry to have kept you," he said. "I went away not to evade your summons, but to post to my newspaper an account of what I suppose I am called back to relate." The coroner smiled. "The account that you posted to your newspaper," he said, "differs probably from that which you will give here under oath." "That," replied the other, rather hotly and with a visible flush, "is as you choose. I used manifold paper, and I have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it is incredible, but as fiction. It may go as a part of my testimony under oath. But you say it is incredible. That is nothing to you, sir, if I also swear that it is true." The coroner was apparently not greatly affected by the young man's manifest resentment. He was silent for some moments, his eyes upon the floor. The men about the sides of the cabin talked in whispers, but seldom withdrew their gaze from the face of the corpse. Presently the coroner lifted his eyes and said, "We will resume the inquest." The men removed their hats. The witness was sworn. "What is your name?" the coroner asked. "William Harker. Age, 27. You knew the deceased, Hugh Morgan?" "Yes." "You were with him when he died, near him?" "How did that happen? Your presence, I mean." "I was visiting him at this place to shoot and fish. A part of my purpose, however, was to study him, and his odd solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in my fiction. I sometimes write stories." "I sometimes read them." "Thank you." "Stories in general, not yours." Some of the jurors laughed. Against a somber background, humor shows highlights. Soldiers in the intervals of battle laugh easily, and the jest in the death chamber conquers by surprise. "Relate the circumstances of this man's death," said the coroner. "You may use any notes or memoranda that you please." The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candle, and turning the leaves until he found the passage that he wanted, began to read. "The sun had hardly risen when we left the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but we had only one dog. Morgan said that our best ground was beyond a certain ridge that he pointed out, and we crossed it by a trail through the chaparral. On the other side was comparatively level ground, thickly covered with wild oats. As we emerged from the chaparral, Morgan was but a few yards in advance. Suddenly we heard, at a little distance to our right, and partly in front, a noise as if some animal thrashing about in the bushes, which we could see was violently agitated. "We've startled a deer," said. "I wish we had brought a rifle." Morgan, who had stopped and was intently watching the agitated chaparral, said nothing, but had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding it in readiness to aim. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me, for he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. "Oh, come," I said, "you are not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you?" Still, he did not reply. But catching a sight of his face as he turned it slightly towards me, I was struck by the pallor of it. Then I understood that we had serious business on hand, and my first conjecture was that we had jumped a grizzly. I advanced to Morgan's side, cocking my piece as I moved. The bushes were now quiet, and the sounds had ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. "What is it? "What the devil is it?" I asked. "That damn thing," he replied, without turning his head. His voice was husky and unnatural. He trembled visibly. I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seemed as if it stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it, so that it did not rise, and this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly towards us. Nothing that I had ever seen had affected me so strangely as this unfamiliar and unaccountable phenomenon. Yet I am unable to recall any sense of fear. I remember and tell it here because singularly enough I recalled it then, that once, in looking carelessly out of an open window, I momentarily mistook a small tree close at hand for one of a group of larger trees at a little distance away. It looked the same size as the others, but being more distinctly and sharply defined in mass and detail, seemed out of harmony with them. It was a mere falsification of the law of aerial perspective, but it startled, almost terrified me. We so rely upon the orderly operations of familiar natural laws that any seeming suspicion of them is noted as a menace to our safety, a warning of unthinkable calamity. So now, the apparently causeless movement of the herbage and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance was distinctly disquieting. My companion appeared actually frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses when I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulders and fire both barrels at the agitated grass. Before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, I heard a loud, savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran swiftly from the spot. At the same instant, I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke, some soft, heavy substance that seemed thrown against me with great force. Before I could get upon my feet and recover my gun, which seemed to have been struck from my hands, I heard Morgan crying out as if in mortal agony. And mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. Inexpressibly terrified, I struggled to my feet and looked in the direction of Morgan's retreat, and may heaven in mercy spare me from another sight like that. At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down upon one knee, his head thrown back at a frightful angle, hatless, his long hair in disorder, and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backward and forward. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand, at least I could see none. The other arm was invisible. At times, as my memory now reports this extraordinary scene, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partly blotted out. I cannot otherwise express it. Then a shifting of his position would bring it all into view again. All this must have occurred within a few seconds, yet in the time Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not always distinctly. During the entire incident, his shouts and curses were heard, as if through an enveloping uproar of such sounds of rage and fury as I had never heard from the throat of a man or brute. For a moment only I stood irresolute. Then throwing down my gun, I ran forward to my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit or some form of convulsion. Before I could reach his side, he was down and quiet. All sounds had ceased, but with a feeling of such terror as even those awful events had not inspired, I now saw the same mysterious movement of the wild oats prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man towards the edge of the wood. It was only when it had reached the wood that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion. He was dead. The coroner rose from his seat and stood beside the dead man. Lifting an edge of the sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the entire body, altogether naked and showing in the candlelight a clay-like yellow. It had, however, broad maculations of bluish-black, obviously caused by extravasated blood from contusions. The chest and sides looked as if they had been beaten with a bludgeon. There were dreadful lacerations. The skin was torn in strips and shreds. The coroner moved round to the end of the table and undid a silk handkerchief, which had been passed under the chin and knotted on the top of the head. When the handkerchief was drawn away, it exposed what had been the throat. Some of the jurors who had risen to get a better view repented their curiosity and turned away their faces. Witness Harker went to the open window and leaned out across the sill, faint and sick. Dropping the handkerchief upon the dead man's neck, the coroner stepped to an angle of the room, and from a pile of clothing produced one garment after another, each of which he held up as a moment for inspection. All were torn and stiff with blood. The jurors did not make a closer inspection. They seemed rather uninterested. They had, in truth, seen all this before, the only thing that was new to them being Harker's testimony. "Gentlemen," the coroner said, "we have no more evidence, I think. Your duty has been already explained to you. If there is nothing you wish to ask, you may go outside and consider your verdict." The foreman rose, a tall, bearded man of 60, coarsely clad. "I should like to ask one question, Mr. Coroner," he said. "What asylum did this your last witness escape from?" "Mr. Harker," said the coroner, gravely and tranquilly. "From what asylum did you last escape?" Harker flushed crimson again, but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out of the cabin. "If you have done insulting me, sir," said Harker, as soon as he and the officer were left alone with the dead man, "I suppose I am at liberty to go?" "Yes." Harker started to leave, but paused, with his hand on the door latch. The habit of his profession was strong in him, stronger than his sense of personal dignity. He turned about and said, "The book that you have there, I recognize it as Morgan's diary. You seemed greatly interested in it. You read in it while I was testifying. May I see it? The public would like—" "The book will cut no figure in this matter," replied the official, slipping it into his coat pocket. "All the entries in it were made before the writer's death." As Harker passed out of the house, the jury re-entered and stood about the table on which the now covered corpse showed under the sheet with sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and scrap of paper, and wrote rather laboriously the following verdict, which with various degrees of effort all signed. "We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion, but some of us thinks, all the same, they had fits." In the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having, possibly, a scientific value as suggestions. At the inquest upon his body, the book was not put into evidence. Possibly the coroner thought it not worth while to confuse the jury. The date of the first of the entries mentioned cannot be ascertained. The upper part of the leaf is torn away. The part of the entry remaining is as follows. Would run in a half circle, keeping his head turned away toward the center, and again he would stand still, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could. I thought at first that he had gone mad, but on returning to the house found no other alterations in his manner than what was obviously due to fear of punishment. Can a dog see with his nose? Do odors impress some olfactory center with images of the thing emitting them? September 2nd. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the ridge east of the house, I observed them successively disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but an instant, and only a few at the same time. But along the entire length of the ridge, all that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. Ugh, I don't like this. Several weeks' entries are missing. 3 leaves were torn from the book. September 27th. It had been about here again. I find evidences of its presence every day. I watched again all of last night in the same cover, gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning the fresh footprints were there, as before. Yet I would have sworn that I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly slept at all. It is terrible, insupportable. If these amazing experiences are real, I shall go mad. If they are fanciful, I am mad already. October 3rd. I shall not go. It shall not drive me away. No, this is my house, my land. God hates a coward. October 5th. I can stand it no longer. I have invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks me mad. October 7th. I have the solution of the problem. It came to me last night, suddenly, as by revelation. How simple, how terribly simple. There are sounds that we cannot hear. At either end of the scale are notes that stir no chord of that imperfect instrument, the human ear. They are too high or too grave. I have observed a flock of blackbirds occupying an entire treetop, the tops of several trees, and all in full song. Suddenly, in a moment, at abruptly the same instant, all spring into the air and fly away. How? They could not all see one another. Whole treetops intervened. At no point could a leader have been visible to all. There must have been a signal of warning or command, high and shrill above the din, but by me unheard. I have observed, too, the same simultaneous flight, when all were silent, among not only blackbirds, but other birds, quail, for example, widely separated by bushes, even on opposite sides of the hill. It is known to seamen that a school of whales basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean, miles apart, with the convexity of the earth between them, will sometimes dive at the same instant, all gone out of sight in a moment. The signal has been sounded, too grave for the ear of the sailor at the masthead and his comrades on the deck, who nevertheless feel its vibrations in the ship as the stones of the cathedral are stirred by the bass of the organ. As with sounds, so with colors. At each end of the solar spectrum, the chemist can detect the presence of what are known as actinic rays. They represent colors, integral colors in the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is an imperfect instrument. Its range is but a few octaves of the real chromatic scale. I am not mad. There are colors that we cannot see. And, God help me, the damn thing is such a color. There's a small town in the Midwest that has an interesting myth surrounding it. At the top of a densely forested hill sits an old, ancient graveyard. Because of its faded tombstones, no one could pinpoint the exact date it was started. It was said in the early 1900s that the local undertaker was digging a grave. When he was at the 6-foot level, he made a remarkable discovery. He had happened to come across huge chunks of gold, but instead of keeping this incredible find a secret, he decided to bring it to the town mayor and his local council, and he asked them the question of, what would you like to do with this discovery? The town mayor and the rest of the committee were completely flabbergasted and also impressed by the fact that this undertaker decided to not keep this gold a secret and that he wanted to share the discovery with everyone else. So they made the decision that no matter what they ended up doing, they wanted to keep the undertaker a part of the future plans. They obviously wanted to build a gold mine because they wanted to get to the riches that were below the graveyard. But then they had to go through that whole contemplation of morality, of is it okay to build a mine so close to a graveyard? So they came to an agreement and a conclusion, and the idea was that they would go ahead and they would build this mine next to the graveyard. But almost as if kind of hush money, they told the undertaker that any other gold that he would discover while digging the graves in the cemetery, that was his gold and his gold alone to keep. And that the gold from the mine, that a small percentage, no matter what, would always go towards the town. So there it was. The opening entrance to the mine was built only about a good 20 yards away from this cemetery. but the town was only seeing dollar signs at this time. And only within a short amount of time, the mine became very lucrative. So all thoughts of morality of building a gold mine extremely close to a cemetery was buried away by the fact that the whole town was becoming rich. Not just rich, but filthy rich on top of that. When word got out about the gold in this town, more people migrated to the place to work the mine. Several months had gone by, and the workers of the mine had dug deeper and deeper, and they were quickly finding more and more gold along the tunnels. But they soon had discovered that strange things were happening as they were digging deeper and deeper into the earth. Strange things that they couldn't account for at first. Tools would go missing or just misplaced. And several weird accidents kept happening, almost as if booby traps were set up along the tunnel. At first, the workers thought that somebody was trying to sabotage them, so they started turning on one another. But soon after this is when several of the people started going missing in the mine. Then, when people started mysteriously going missing, that's when they also started discovering these strange clawed marks that were showing up in the mud. And the deeper you would go into the mine, you would see more and more of these footprints showing up. And as the rumors started to fly about the workers going missing more and more, then all of a sudden, the local town folks themselves started disappearing. In the darkest of nights, when the stars and the moon were heavily hidden by thick, dense clouds, was the nights that the townsfolk could swear they could hear strange sounds of unfamiliar animals that they had never heard before. And it was always the following day that the town would discover that somebody else had gone missing. And sure enough, at the houses of the people who had disappeared, were these same strange, mysterious footprints that were in the mine. Superstition and fear quickly spread throughout the town. Of course, what do people normally do with a mob mentality? They decided to blame the mayor and the council for creating this mine so close to a graveyard. And they started naming it the Graveyard's Curse. They had decided that the mine clearly was no longer safe because they felt that the workers had created a gateway to hell and that these creatures were demons coming to seek revenge on the town, and that they were there to punish them for their greed, and that this gold was blood money and it was dangerous. So the mayor and the committee and the rest of the town all decided to vote on what they wanted to do with the mine. And even knowing what a great loss it would be, they all unanimously voted to close down the mine. Going into the deepest part of the tunnel is where they decided to collapse the tunnels with explosives. Then at the entrance, they made sure that they blocked it away with boards and bricks so that no one else could enter. And sure enough, after the mine was closed away, the disappearances had finally stopped. As the years and decades had passed by, the story of the mine had turned into myth and urban legend for the local town. It felt as if it was only strange fables to tell the children, to scare them away from the area. But to this day, the local teenagers still like to play Truth or Dare up in the cemetery. And in the darkest of nights, when they are up in the cemetery and dare their friends to stand in front of the old abandoned mine. For if you are standing at the mouth of the mine, even on the other side of the rotted boards and the cracked bricks, you can hear haunting growls and moans traveling up through the tunnels. So even though to this day the town knows that the mine is rich with gold, no one dares to reopen it for fear of the graveyard's curse.
In the late 1980s, you had the Soviet Union and America were at great odds with one another. Of course, one of the greatest things that they were in battle about was who could travel farther into space. So you had the great space race going on. But not only were they both at odds with one another to see who could get the farthest and make the biggest discoveries out in space, they were also at odds with seeing who could travel deeper into the Earth's core. But you had the Soviet Union, who was on that race first. You have Mr. Azakov and his team of Soviet engineers who went to an unknown location in Siberia, and that their plan was to take some drilling equipment and to see how far deep and down below they could go. They wanted to see just how far they could make it into the Earth's core. But as they took their drill and started digging down deep, about the 9-mile mark, they had made a very unusual and peculiar discovery. So, taking a heat-resistant microphone and several other sensory equipment, they slowly lowered it down into this tunnel. And the farther down that the equipment went, that's when they started realizing that the temperatures were steadily and very quickly rising. Temperatures that they had never seen before in their lives. At the 9-mile mark, there was a record high of 1,000 degrees Celsius. That's 1,832 degrees in Fahrenheit. No one would be able to survive in temperatures like this. In fact, the equipment was slowly having issues and problems being around those temperatures. But not only were they realizing how hot the temperatures were down in this cavity, something else came to be. From the microphone, the Soviet engineers could hear these haunting, terrifying screams coming from the depths below. And they had realized that they had dug a well to hell, and that they were hearing the tormented screams of the people who were trapped down in hell and being tormented by demons below. And of course, after this great discovery was made, rumors began to spread across the country. And it traveled into Europe, to where you even had Finland, who was writing in newspapers and talking about the well to hell that was discovered in the Soviet Union. Well, of course, word got back to America. And as the myths and legends started to spread about the great discovery of the well to hell, the Americans, of course, wanted to do the same. Because how dare anybody else make this discovery before they did? So they pulled together 13 different engineers and scientists, and they all pulled their team together in a private location in a gorge in the middle of Ohio. Here, they were able to take their drill, and just like the Soviet Union engineers, they started to dig deeper and deeper, creating a gigantic cavity in the middle of the earth. And the deeper they went, they started to discover the exact same strange things that they were discovering over in the Soviet Union. And as this drill started to lower farther and farther into the earth, about the 6 or 7 mile mark was when they started to realize that the equipment was starting to falter, and they couldn't for sure figure out why. And as soon as they made it to the same mile mark as what the Soviet Union engineers had done, at the 9 mile mark, they realized that the drill was having problems and would not drill down deeper. So the same thing as over in Siberia, these engineers and scientists started to take a heat-resistant microphone and sensory equipment and slowly lower it down into the cavity. And as they went down deeper and deeper into this hole, They started to uncover that the temperatures were the exact same highs as what they were over in the Soviet area. That they were seeing 1,000 degrees Celsius, 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's not all they had uncovered. Obviously, with those high temperatures, the equipment was faltering, which is exactly why the drill had stopped working. It was as if it was trying to drill into plastic, and it just would not go through anymore since it wasn't dirt and rock anymore. It was like melted molten lava. Obviously, with the heat and the high extreme temperatures, the microphone and the sensory equipment were going on the fritz as well. But before the microphone had officially cut off, one sound had traveled through before it all faded to static. The same tormented and horrifying screams that sounded like tortured souls in the depths of hell traveled through the microphone until everything just cut off, and all that was left was that haunting silent sound as all 13 engineers and scientists stood there baffled. Obviously, after learning about the existence of hell down below in the Earth's core, the American scientists and engineers knew that they could not open this portal to hell. And they also knew that they needed to keep this discovery a secret, because if the rest of the world had found out about this existence, all hell would break loose in a matter of speaking. So this well to hell was sealed away and closed. Everything about the well to hell became of myth, became of rumors, became of legends. So we may want to continue flying higher into space and seeing what different planets and galaxies we can discover. But we definitely do not want to keep drilling and digging down below, for we might find the terrifying truth and the portal of the well to hell.
In a small Midwest town lived two girls who had been friends for several years. They had first become friends in grade school, and these girls, Tara and Stacy, they had been in the same class their entire life, but they had never been close to one another. But because of fate, they ended up at this friend's birthday party. And while they were there, they discovered that they both had a love for ghost stories. And late at night, for this birthday slumber party, Tara and Stacy decided to share scary stories with one another. While the rest of the girls were all scared and petrified and didn't want to be around the two weirdos that loved the supernatural, Tara and Stacy had become close friends because of this. But unfortunately, as soon as they hit 16, Tara started to go on a rebellious streak. And partly because of her parents. Her parents started getting it in their head that Tara was messing up and that she was sneaking out at night, and they thought that she was misbehaving in these weird random ways. To the point that Tara finally got this personality of, well, they already think that I do, so I might as well just do it. And no matter how supportive her best friend Stacy wanted to be, and she wanted to be there for her friend and to kind of be a good influence for her, she realized that no matter what she said, Tara was going to do whatever Tara wanted to do. And she knew that things were only going to get worse when she got her brand new boyfriend Travis. Travis started to introduce her to several other bad habits. Tara started smoking, she started drinking, and she even started doing drugs, and she was sneaking out late at night. Stacy, over time, started to distance herself from her friend because she realized there wasn't much she could do. But on one summer night, Tara had reached out to her friend and had told her, "I miss you. I miss our horror nights." So she had invited Stacy to come stay the night with her, and that they would do their usual like they used to do, and stay up late and watch horror movies. Elated and excited, Stacy, of course, wanted to go over to her friend's house. And late that night, they were set up and they were watching a movie, but she noticed that Tara seemed very distracted. She kept looking at her watch, to the point where Stacy finally asked her, "Hey, what is going on? You seem really distracted tonight. Every time I brought up a subject to talk about, you just don't even seem like you're interested." So Tara finally makes a confession, and while whispering to her friend, she tells her, "When my parents go to bed, we're sneaking out, and we're going down to the local park, and my boyfriend Travis is going to meet us. He's picking us up, and we're going to go hang out at his house tonight." Well, Stacy, completely upset with her friend, was like, "I thought this was the plan, that we were going to hang out and watch horror movies." Tara right away gets defensive and flat out says, "Well, I want to see my boyfriend tonight, so you can either come along with me or you can just stay here by yourself." Well, Stacy decides to just shrug her shoulders and is like, "Well, I don't really want my friend sneaking out by herself." So she makes the dumb decision that she's going to follow her friend sneaking out. Now, for most teenagers, you would think if they were sneaking out that they would just use their car because they are old enough to drive. Well, because of Tara's rebellious streak, her parents had started taking her keys at night and they would hide them because they had caught their daughter sneaking around at night. So because they didn't trust her, this is one of their punishments that they had. So late at night, it was around midnight, Tara and Stacy had realized that everybody in the household had finally gone to bed. And while it was completely dark, they snuck down to the basement because this was Tara's little trick. She didn't have to use the front door because her parents had a safety lock on there. But she knew that if she went and used the cellar door down in the basement, that her parents would never hear or notice her leaving. So that is the way that the two young teenagers had snuck out of Tara's house. And they made their way to the backyard and followed the fence line until they had gotten to the local park. Sure enough, Stacy had noticed that Travis was sitting there and he was in his red pickup truck. Once the girls were in the truck with him and they started heading away, Tara instantly had noticed that Travis had turned in the wrong direction for his house. And he quickly explained to her that they were actually going to go to his friend John's house and that he was having a party at his place. And he figured that they would rather do that instead. Stacy is instantly upset. She has absolutely no interest in sneaking out and being here with just Tara and Travis, and now to find out that he was taking them to a party, she was completely uncomfortable and not okay with this idea. She kept trying to poke at her friend Tara, but she just kept ignoring her friend, to the point they finally got to John's house, and instantly Stacy started noticing something strange. There were no extra cars around the house. So when she was asking Travis this question, he just kind of made it seem like, "Oh, well, they parked elsewhere because we can't make it look like there's a big party going on somewhere in the middle of town. That would make it suspicious and the cops would show up." Well, as soon as they get in the house, instantly Stacy realizes that Travis has been lying to them because the only people that were there were John and Dan, and they were just in the living room playing video games. So there wasn't a party going on. But once they were there, John had offered the girls some drinks. Tara instantly had taken a beer, but Stacy had declined any alcohol, so she had asked if she could have some water. Well, now that they were there as a group, they all decided, hey, let's sit around and watch a movie. So they find a movie and they put it on. It's just a silly little comedy, and Stacy's still feeling kind of uncomfortable because everybody around her is now drinking. She already didn't want to be here, and she barely knew John and Dan as it was. And the movie had only been playing for about 20 minutes when Tara and Travis had decided that they wanted to go into the kitchen and get some more drinks. So they had disappeared, and after a while, Stacy had realized that it had been quite a bit of time and neither one of them had come back. Well, Stacy had kind of just shrugged it off and had realized, oh, duh, Tara and Travis had just snuck to the bag and that they were probably just making out and fooling around. But at the same time, Stacy then realizing that she's alone with a couple of guys from her class that she didn't really know and she just felt awkward and uncomfortable. So she's watching this silly comedy with them and just realizing that more and more time is going by. And it's not until the movie's end credits come on is when Travis and Tara finally come back. Instantly, Stacy realizes that something is off. Tara seems out of it. She doesn't seem like herself. And it's just little subtle things that Stacy could just pick up. And she instantly starts asking her friend, hey, what's wrong? Not even being able to answer for herself. Travis comes in and says she's just fine. Stacy, completely upset about this, says, I'm not asking you, I'm asking my friend. Tara just kind of looks at her and says, yeah, everything's perfectly fine. But Stacy, getting up and really close to her friend, starts to realize that there are strange marks on her friend, and that some of her clothes is even torn. So Stacy keeps poking questions at her. Travis finally decides to blow up and starts yelling at Stacy and tells her, you want to know what's wrong? I just dumped your best friend. She's a fucking terrible girlfriend and I want nothing to do with her. And I want you and your dumbasses to get out of this house. So this finally gets Tara to snap out of it. And she looks at Travis and she flat out says, wait, you're not going to drop us off? And he flat out tells her, no, you can go take care of yourself and you can find your own way home. So Stacy, kind of pleading, looks at John and Dan to see if maybe one of them would be willing to take them home. But John just shakes his head and says, I'm sorry, it's past curfew. I won't chance driving you back home. So now it is about 2 a.m, and Tara and Stacy have to sneak all the way across town. And they find themselves running from alley to alley and trying to quietly get by building to building, trying to make sure that nobody notices them, because the last thing they needed to do was to get caught. But on the way back to Tara's house, Stacy finally starts poking questions at Tara, and in a very sympathetic way, she starts asking her what happened. Tara finally breaks down and cries to her friend and tells her what Travis had done. And that obviously when they went to the kitchen to get some drinks and that Travis took her to a side room to make out with her. And Tara said the next thing she knew, he pinned her down and he took advantage of her. And without her consent, she felt completely ashamed and broken. Stacy, wanting to be sympathetic to her friend, held on to her and told her none of this was your fault. But Tara kept blaming herself for what had happened. So once Tara had finally calmed down, the girls made the rest of the way back to Tara's house. In the dark, they made their way through the backyard and found the cellar doors. So of course, they slowly snuck back in and made their way back to Tara's bedroom. Once they were there, the girls lay down for the rest of the night. But in the silence, Stacy could hear her friend cry herself to sleep. The next morning felt incredibly awful. It felt like they didn't get a wink of sleep. But they had to get up when the rest of the family did to have breakfast, to make it look like nothing had happened. And as far as they could tell, the family had no idea that they had snuck out that night. But while they were all gathered around the table having breakfast, there was a knock at the front door. Tara's father had gotten up and went to see who it was. After a while, he finally came back, and he made his way to Tara, and he gave her the biggest hug he could possibly give her. When Tara had finally asked what was wrong, he had explained to her and said that Travis had been found that morning and that he had killed himself, and that he had left a suicide note explaining that he felt incredibly guilty for what he had done to Tara and that he could not live with himself anymore. Obviously, this had completely devastated Tara. She had wept and finally told them everything that had happened. And her parents very calmly explained to her that none of this was her fault. After Tara had finally calmed down, Tara's parents had asked Stacy if she could make her way home, that they wanted to just have a private moment with their family while this situation was going on. Stacy gave her best friend the biggest hug she possibly could and told her, I am here for you for whatever you need, And if you need me, I will be here." After Stacy had made her way back home, she realized that she was there by herself. Using that opportunity, she had taken her overnight bag and she had made her way to the back of the barn. Her and her family lived out in the country, and they didn't have a neighbor next door to them, so she knew she wouldn't be seen. Reaching into her duffel bag, she removed a black garbage bag. Inside it, one could see that it was the clothes that she had worn the night before, but they were completely saturated in blood. Stacy had taken the bag of bloody clothes and had thrown it into the burning barrel, lighting it all on fire and letting the flames take over. But she knew in her heart that Travis would never hurt another soul, and she knew that no matter what, she would be there for her friend, and that she would gladly take this secret to the grave with her. Lost Souls by Jeff Parsons, May 24th, 1944. The damp air smothered Hans with a slow asphyxiation of hot sweat, carbon dioxide, and diesel fuel. Each breath grew more and more tortured, not so much from the persuasive soggy drip of foul moisture clogging his lungs, but from the thought of what caused the U-292 German submarine to shudder, as if in anticipated pleasure. The U-boat was cruising along the surface in attack mode with other subs in the wolf pack. They preyed upon the merchant cargo ships that crossed the unforgiving sea from Newfoundland to England. Each time the ship shook, a torpedo was sent away through the frigid North Atlantic Ocean towards its hapless convoy target. Hans sat in the narrow toilet stall behind a flimsy curtain screen, leaning forward with his head cradled by his trembling hands, ashamed of his behavior, but unable to control it any more. He carefully eased a photograph from his uniform's breast pocket. Stroking the portrait of his love, Greta, he wondered yet again how he was going to stay sane. U-boat service extracted a heavy toll upon him. He winced yet again. Hans thought he could hear the harsh shriek of the enemy vessels tearing apart after each torpedo hit, but he knew that was unlikely, for the submarine's twin diesel engines were humming along at low throttle in the nearby bulkhead compartment. He had heard that sound before, the dreadful shearing metal sound of sinking ships, and it haunted him. Like being underneath a waterfall, thunderous bubbling accompanied the dying theros of a merchant ship as it cracked open like a fragile eggshell. The deadly water flooding inside and the sailors within, he swore that he could hear the sounds of their lost souls screaming, just like in his nightmares. Gott im Himmel. They were dying, he thought. Even if the sailors survived the sudden tremulous sinking, they'd be cast adrift into the freezing wave-wrecked water to die with little hope of rescue. "Hans, get your butt out of there now," Gruber, the head mechanic, bellowed from the engine room. Hans sighed. He kissed Greta's snapshot and slid it back into his pocket. Standing up, he wiped off the sweat streaking down his face and left his safe haven. Back to work. The endless war needed him. Gruber frowned at him. "Did you get lost?" "No, I just felt sick. Queasy," he lied. "Must be something I ate." "Uh-huh," Gruber said, tapping on a pressure gauge by the noisy diesel engines. Hans knew how lame his response sounded. They had just been restocked with fresh food from a submarine supply ship. It was unlikely that the food had been spoiled. He didn't hear the sound of torpedoes being fired anymore. Is the attack over? Gruber was busy starting the electronic engines. They were used for quiet running engines, instead of the diesels, which would be shut off before the submarine slid beneath the waves. No more torpedoes left. We'll have to connect with the supply ship again. Gruber looked up at Hans, then smiled slightly, not unkindly. "Hans, this is what we do. Best get used to it. And don't let the Uber lieutenant or anyone else know about your feelings, okay?" "Ja. Thanks, Gruber. I'll do my best."
The submarine had left the oil-slick scene of floating carnage and escaped unharmed into the vast rolling sea. Later that evening, Oberlieutenant Charsie Herr Werner Schmidt, their commander, gave an announcement over the ship's comm. "We have fought with great valor. Each torpedo struck a mighty blow to the enemy's supply lines. We have saved the lives of many a valiant German soldier. On behalf of the fatherland, I commend you once again for your selfless acts of bravery." Hans cringed on the inside. He didn't want to share his emotions with the other crewmates settled around him in the aft sleeping quarters. The crowded room contained bunks stacked 3 high, filled with crewmen lying on their off hours, too restless to sleep. The hypnotic tempo of water condensate dripping from the ceiling, piping, and curved walls encouraged Hans' mind to wander into places he'd rather not consider, such as the meaning behind Schmidt's words. Schmidt was right about bravery. Craig's marine U-boat service was dangerous. An encounter with an enemy destroyer was lethal in most cases, let alone the technical problems associated with repeatedly diving deep into the briny depths. The experience was unnatural. It took a certain amount of mental fortitude to be a submariner. Even so, everyone was always so solemn after a battle. Perhaps they realized that sooner or later their luck would run out and death could overtake them. His friend Fadi broke the silent gloom. He said, "Looks like we've single-handedly saved the fatherland again." Several tired smirks were exchanged at Fadi's remark. He smiled ruefully, then said, "I talked with some of the supply ship crew when their officers weren't looking. They said supplies were running short. No one was getting what they needed." "Rudy," one of the pipe fitters said, "Yeah, and they also said something else." "Rudy, no need to bring that up." Johann, another pipe fitter, grumbled. "I think it's important. Did you see the expressions on their faces?" Rudy asked. "They were scared," Rudy said, his voice going low. "Afraid to talk much. One of them said they were being hunted." "Ha," Fadi said. "What do they expect? It's a war. We're all combatants here, even the merchant ships." "That's true," Johann said sadly. "We must kill our fellow mariners to win this war. Then, if it's our time, we can go home." Hans thought, what would we say when we met our maker? That we were following orders? The boat waited at the pre-designated rendezvous coordinates for the supply ship's restocking of torpedoes and other essentials. The crew was kept busy with the many routine tasks of maintenance, operations, and testing, part of which involved quick certification dives to check for leaks that inevitably sprouted. During the dives, Hans dreaded hearing the hull's metal shrieking due to the enormous forces crushing against the ship. If the seawater pressure could compress the submarine's high-strength steel, what could it do to him if the ship imploded? The ship continued to complain like an old woman shuffling across the kitchen floor on a winter morning. In fact, it sounded like his beloved grandmother, Brunhilde, God rest her soul. Hans had been trained to know the sounds of the ship, so when he heard something new amidst the hull's normal groaning, popping and creaking, he was quick to investigate it. It was a rhythmic, tinkling sound that traveled along the piping of the ship's water cooling system. He had to fix whatever was making the sound. An unexpected mechanical failure could potentially sink the boat. Also, excessive spurious noise was dangerous on the submarine. The enemy destroyers had hydrophones that could detect underwater sound. If they knew where they were, they could kill you. Listening carefully, he patiently tracked the sound towards its source, ducking and squeezing through crowded spaces full of machinery, support struts, and piping systems. It wasn't much different than working on the plumbing under his grandmother's sink back in Dresden, except now he rarely hit his head when he moved without thinking. The sound originated inside the main ballast area, a large hollow tank situated within the hulls underneath the control room. Inside the tank, a careful balance of air and water was maintained to raise and lower the ship's depths, and incidentally, it was used as a backup reserve for breathing air. There was also 4 other ballast tanks located outside of the hull, fore and aft, and along each side. Without sufficient air in the ballast tanks, the ship would sink like a weighted corpse. What the hell was that? It was almost like a glass bottle bouncing against metal. Perhaps one of the shipyard's fitters had left their stash of liquor in there?
He'd have to tell Gruber about it. Gruber wouldn't be happy. The reasons behind mysterious sounds were elusive at times. They might not be able to repair this type of problem at sea. The supply ship never showed up. Schmidt decided to travel back to port. It was a disgraceful waste of diesel, but the ship needed torpedoes. Hans thought, even the Angel of Death has its limits. Still, the crew's morale was high. Back to merry Spain, where shore leave, booze and women awaited them, while the ship underwent an overhaul and torpedo reload. Then, the unthinkable happened. A man didn't show up at his workstation. The cook, Alfred, who was also an assistant electrician, hadn't been seen since last night. The crewmen methodically searched the ship, section by section, bulkhead door by bulkhead door. No one could slip past them. When the crew met up in the command center, Schmidt announced that the cook was nowhere to be found. Everyone was to keep a lookout for him. Where could he have gone while submerged under the sea? Gruber whispered something into Schmidt's ear. Schmidt looked at Hans, then said, "Prepare for ascent to surface. We need to recharge the air. While we're doing that, we'll check the internal ballast compartment. We probably have a sound short." The captain gave the command. The ship rose to periscope depth. Schmidt scanned the surrounding sea and gave the order to surface. Hans and another crewman, Dieter, were chosen to enter the main ballast tank. Hans' slight frame made it easier for him to squeeze through confined spaces, so he was regularly chosen for tasks like these. The tank's hatchway was unlocked and opened. After 10 minutes of letting the tank air out, they entered one at a time through the narrow hatchway. He took a final deep breath before submerging himself into the cloying darkness. The lights from their electric lanterns did little to dispel his anxiety. They split up, searching for the cause of the mysterious sound. Hans left behind the one-way in and out of this foul-smelling area, cramped with interconnecting metal-supporting baffles, struts, and piping. Good thing the sea weather was relatively mild. It was difficult enough walking on the slippery surfaces without the boat rocking wildly. A few minutes later, Dieter yelped, not a typical sound that one would hear from a seasoned sailor. Hans moved towards his partner, stepping over and bending around obstructions until he got to where Dieter leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. Dieter's sickened expression said it all. Hans wasn't going to like this. He saw a head, just a head, no body. The head rolled with the shifting of the boat and kept hitting a pipe that passed through the wall structure. Mein Gott, his teeth. The teeth hit the pipe, making the tinkling noise. Hans shuddered. It was Alfred's head. Alfred, who had once told Hans how he missed his wife, his childhood sweetheart, and their 2 young girls, who would squeal with delight when he pushed them on their tire swing. Dieter trudged back to the hatchway to ask for direction on what to do next. Hans stood awkwardly in silence, his lantern light playing across what remained of his shipmate, knowing that the only access into that area, the hatchway, had been padlocked closed. How the hell did Alfred get in here? What the hell happened to him? They never found the rest of the body, so they once again submerged, traveling on a course back to port. Morale was low. Schmidt authorized a ration of schnapps for the crewmen, but the drink seemed to make everyone feel melancholy. Several hours later, loud noises started to bang intermittently against the outside length of the ship. Fatty joked with Hans, saying that the boat must be looking very sexy to some of the amorous whales in the region. Hans laughed nervously, knowing that wouldn't be a first in naval history, but it was highly unlikely. The noises continued to disturb everyone's sanity. Schmidt described the anomaly as a mechanical problem that would need to get fixed at a port shipyard. Then another person went missing. It was Grubbard, the ship's best navigator, last seen going to his bunk for a quick nap. Again, the crewmen went through the same drill. Grubbard couldn't be found, so after verifying that no other ship were in the area, the submarine was raised to the surface. When the top hatch was popped open, a brief waterfall of cold seawater spilled inside. The banging noise stopped. A storm had been brewing outside. Some crewmen were sent topside, tasked with inspecting the outside of the ship to see what had been causing the ruckus banging noises. Hans was called to duty again, along with Dieter, to search the main ballast tank. He dreaded going in there again. Will we find what's left of Gebert? Sweating in the dark, even though the air was damp and chilly,
Hans groped his way around cold metal and over slippery surfaces. The ship's rocking slowed his progress through the ballast tank. About halfway through his search, he heard the call to return to the hatchway. Schmidt wanted them to come see something. They were directed towards the torpedo room, where the nervous crewmen were assembled. What Hans saw shocked him to the core. It was Gubbard, strung up, suspended in midair, electrical wires woven deep into his flesh and connected to the piping overhead, looking like the sacrifice portrayed on the cross he wore around his neck. Gubbard's skin was a fish-white color. His waxy eyes were bugged out, and seawater still dripping from his body, obviously drowned, yet trussed up here before the group. They had searched this area not long ago. Impossible as it was, it must have happened recently. Mechanical problem, my ass! Schmidt took control of the paralyzing situation. Take him down, gently. Put him in the machine shop. Men, stay sharp. Go back to your stations. Make sure that we're running safe and secure. Then reassemble in a quarter of an hour at operations. We'll get to the bottom of this. Dismissed. He then motioned for his officers to confer with him, as if seeking counsel on what to do next. Hans was alarmed that the order wasn't given to submerge the ship. They were extremely vulnerable to the enemy on the surface. Then again, being below the waves had definitely proven to be lethal. Hans went back to the engine room with Gruber and Michael, the mechanist mate who assisted with engine repair. Gruber fussed with the diesels and electric motors. Of course, everything was operating perfectly. They were designed and manufactured by Germans, the best craftsmen in the world. Hans and Michael talked, faces close to each other, at the aft end of the engine room, near a diesel fuel storage tank, out of sight and earshot from Gruber. Are we being hunted as well? Michael asked softly, reminding Hans of what was said by sailors on the supply ship. I don't know. What could do this, and why? Michael was about to answer when he was suddenly jerked backwards into the inky shadows behind the storage tank. It was so quick that only impressions lingered with Hans. Michael's eyes bulging with surprise, a sudden whoosh of displaced air, and outstretched arms, the last thing Hans saw of him. No scream, no sound. Just a hallowed after-image of Michael. Hans hesitated, trembling, then reached forward into the darkness. Nothing there except the sticky bulkhead wall. There was blood coating his fingertips when he pulled his hand back. Gruber! He screamed like a frightened schoolgirl. Hans stared into the darkness, shivering and unmoving, for what seemed like an eternity. His body jerked at Gruber's touch. Gruber saw the blood and cursed. Michael! He's gone, Hans whispered. Something! He's gone! Hans! Gruber yelled. His grip on Hans' shoulder tightened. We need to leave, now! Hans snapped out of his mental fog. Just follow me, okay? Gruber said. Hans nodded. They bolted out of the engine room to the all-hands meeting. Not everyone was there yet. The men kept a wary distance from each other, no longer behaving as comrades, anxious with suspicious looks. Some glared at Hans when they saw the blood dripping from his hands. At this point, the pounding against the ship's hull had started again. Also, there were scratching noises like nails being drawn across the outer skin of the ship. The sounds unnerved the already tense crew. When Schmidt arrived, Gruber began. We lost Michael. Hans said that something. Schmidt gruffly said, That's enough, Gruber. Hans didn't know what was scarier. Schmidt's suddenly harsh voice, holding fast to his Prussian emotional control, or the knowing, frightened looks of the other crewmen staring back at him. Something happened to even more of the others. That's why everyone isn't here. There was a sudden flash to Hans' left. Others saw it happen too. Officer Wildmar was grabbed by something, a sky-blue, misty blur. There he was one moment, and gone the next, pulled through the metal lattice floor like cheese through a grater, drawn out of sight into the dark decks below. Nothing was left of the man except thin strands of ropey red-brown liquids that spilled into the darkness below. There was a brief stillness of awful silence. Then all hell broke loose. Screaming crewmen, mindless with terror, pushed and clawed each other in a raging chaos to escape until Schmidt's loud commanding voice quickly brought the remainder of the panicked crew under disciplined control. Relieving, launch the lifeboats. Prepare to scuttle the boat. On my orders, move it! Shocked as they were by the unusual order, the crew instinctively knew that it was suicidal to remain on board, and, as one, they scrambled to complete their pre-assigned emergency tasks. Visibly shaking, Hans put on rain gear and helped lift one of the rectangular lifeboat packages up the top hatch ladder. The lifeboat was damned heavy, but he had the strength of adrenaline driving him. The weather topside rocked the boat from side to side, even with its heavy ballast. Wind whipped the nighttime waves to smash against the lower conning tower. Electric lantern lights lanced wildly into the rain-soaked deluge of Atlantic darkness. Sailors on the outside deck tried to deploy their rafts while holding onto tether ropes. The treacherous wave action almost made some lose their footing, making it more difficult. One raft was almost ready to go. He heard the sound of an airplane approaching fast from the outcast sky above. He glanced upward. It was probably an enemy dive bomber. What? No, not now. Hans' teeth chattered. The cold was brutal, especially after being inside the humid ship, but he'd also been traumatized by the insanity of recent events. With trembling hands, he and his partner gripped their section of the tether rope while they placed their lifeboat on the deck. They held the lifeboat package in place with their knees and, fumbling, started to undo the straps that held it together. Something heavy splashed nearby into the water, port side of the ship's aft end. Mein Gott, not a depth charge! The explosion was deafening, cracking against the ship with a huge wave that swept along the ship's surface. The wave slapped him hard, forcing salt water into his eyes and mouth. He lost hold of the tether rope as the boat began to list to one side. When he glanced along the ship's waterline, rising out of the rough sea, he saw a myriad of long, thick furrows cut into the metal, like claw marks gutting the belly of a dying beast. Overhead, the plane's engine roared away from the ship into the dark night. There was no scuttle charge detonation. The ship was sinking of its own accord, with help by a near hit from the depth charge. The ship rolled suddenly on its port side as it sank into the sea, throwing everyone off balance and flailing into torrential high-water waves. The cold gripped him mercilessly, squeezing the breath from him and sapping the heat from his shocked body. His heavy rain gear made it impossible to stay surfaced for long as tall waves and fierce undercurrents dashed him about and yanked him under repeatedly, forcing burning salt water down his nose and throat. Where's the raft? The raft! The raft! The raft was lost to his sight long ago in the endless swirling darkness and gurgle of struggling breathing from a great distance. He heard screams off and on when his head broke above the water for moments at a time. He knew he wouldn't last long. The salt water in his eyes distorted his vision, but he thought he saw a flicker of light. The raft. He was saved. The light was closer now, but it wasn't above the waves. It traveled below, moving swiftly, as if unaffected by the weather or waves. The spectral form of light glowed a pale blue, and more followed it, maybe several dozens of them, coming towards him. When he saw what they were, he knew that his time was at an end. The specters of foreign sailors had come to claim their vengeance.
He was waiting for her. He had been waiting an hour and a half in a dusty suburban lane, with a row of big elms on one side and some eligible building sites on the other, and far away to the southwest the twinkling yellow lights of the Crystal Palace. It was not quite like a country lane, for it had a pavement and lamppost, but it was not a bad place for a meeting all the same. And further up towards the cemetery, it was really quite rural, and almost pretty, especially in twilight. But twilight had long deepened into the night, and still he waited. He loved her, and he was engaged to be married to her, with the complete disapproval of every reasonable person who had been consulted. And this half-clandestine meeting was tonight to take the place of the grudgingly sanctioned weekly interview, because a certain rich uncle was visiting at her house, and her mother was not the woman to acknowledge to a moneyed uncle, who might go off any day, a match so deeply ineligible as hers with him. So he waited for her, and the chill of an unusually severe May evening entered into his bones. The policeman passed him with a surly response to his good night. The bicyclists went by him like gray ghosts with foghorns, and it was nearly 10 o'clock, and she had not come. He shrugged his shoulders and turned towards his lodgings. His road led him by her house, desirable, commodious, semi-detached, and he walked slowly as he neared it. She might even now be coming out, but she was not. There was no sign of movement about the house, no sign of life, no lights even in the windows, and her people were not early people. He paused by the gate, wondering. Then he noticed that the front door was open, wide open, and the street lamp shone a little way into the dark hall. There was something about all this that did not please him, that scared him a little indeed. The house had a gloomy and deserted air. It was obviously impossible that it harbored a rich uncle. The old man must have left early, in which case, he walked up the path of patient glazed eyes and listened. No sign of life. He passed into the hall. There was no light anywhere. Where was everybody? And why was the front door open? There was no one in the drawing room, the dining room, and the study. 9 feet by 7 were equally blank. Everyone was out, evidently, but the unpleasant sense that he was, perhaps, not the first casual visitor to walk through the open door impelled him to look through the house before he went away and closed it after him. So he went upstairs, and at the door of the first bedroom he came to, he struck a wax match, as he had done in the sitting rooms. Even as he did so, he felt that he was not alone, and he was prepared to see something, but for what he saw he was not prepared. For what he saw lay on the bed, in a white loose gown, and it was his sweetheart, and its throat was cut from ear to ear. He doesn't know what happened then, nor how he got downstairs and into the street, but he got out somehow, and the policeman found him in a fit, under the lamppost at the corner of the street. He couldn't speak when they picked him up, and he passed the night in the police cells, because the policeman had seen plenty of drunken men before, but never one in a fit. The next morning he was better, though still very white and shaky, but the tale he told the magistrate was convincing, and they sent a couple of constables with him to her house. There was no crowd about it, as he had fancied there would be, and the blinds were not down. He held onto the doorpost for support. "She's all right, you see," said the constable, who had found him under the lamp. "I told you was drunk, but you would know best." When he was alone with her, he told her, not all, for that would not bear telling, but how he had come into the commodious semi-detached, and how he had found the door open and the lights out, and that he had been into the long back room facing the stairs, and had seen something, in even trying to hint at which he turned sick and broke down, and had to have brandy given him. "But my dear," she said, "I dare say the house was dark, for we were all at the Crystal Palace with my uncle, and no doubt the door was open, for the maids will run out if they're left. But you could not have been in that room, because I locked it when I came away, and the key was in my pocket. I dressed in a hurry, and I left all my odds and ends lying about." "I know," he said. "I saw a green scarf on the chair, and some long brown gloves, and a lot of hairpins and ribbons, and a prayer book, and a lace handkerchief on the dressing table. Why, I even noticed the almanac on your mantelpiece, 21 October. At least, it couldn't be that, because this is May, and yet it was. Your almanac is at 21 October, isn't it?" "No, of course it isn't," she said, smiling rather anxiously. "But all the other things were just as you say. You must have had a dream, or a vision, or something." He was a very ordinary, commonplace, city young man, and he didn't believe in visions. But he never rested day or night till he got his sweetheart and her mother away from that commodious semi-detached and settled them in a quiet, distant suburb. In the course of the removal, he incidentally married her, and the mother went on living with them. His nerves must have been a good bit shaken, because he was very queer for a long time, and was always inquiring if anyone had taken the desirable semi-detached, and when an old stockbroker with a family took it, he went the lengths of calling on the old gentleman and imploring him by all that he held dear not to live in that fatal house. "Why?" said the stockbroker, not unnaturally. And then he got so vague and confused between trying to tell why and trying not to tell why that the stockbroker showed him out. and thanked his God he was not such a fool as to allow a lunatic to stand in the way of his taking that really remarkably cheap and desirable semi-detached residence. Now the curious and quite inexplicable part of the story is that when she came down to breakfast on the morning of the 22nd October, she found him looking like death, with the morning paper in his hand. He caught hers, he couldn't speak, and pointed to the paper. And there she read that on the night of the 21st, a young lady, the stockbroker's daughter, had been found, with her throat cut from ear to ear, on the bed in the long back bedroom facing the stairs of that desirable semi-detached.
The grinding stone that ground flour by itself. There had been another great famine throughout the land. The villagers looked thin and pale for lack of food. Only one family appeared healthy and well. This was the household of Anansi's cousin. Anansi was unable to understand this, and felt sure his cousin was getting food in some way. The greedy fellow determined to find out the secret. What had happened was this. Spider's cousin, while hunting one morning, had discovered a wonderful stone. The stone lay on the grass in the forest and ground flour on its own accord. Nearby ran a stream of honey. Kofi was delighted. He sat down and had a good meal. Not being a greedy man, he took away with him only enough for his family's needs. Each morning he returned to the stone and got sufficient food for that day. In this manner, he and his family kept well and plump, while the surrounding villagers were starved and miserable looking. Anansi gave him no peace till he promised to show him the stone. This he was most unwilling to do, knowing his cousin's wicked ways. He felt sure that when Anansi saw the stone, he would not be content to take only what he needed. However, Anansi troubled him so much with questions that at last he promised. He told Anansi that they would start next morning, as soon as the women set about their work. Anansi was too impatient to wait. In the middle of the night, he bade his children get up and make a noise with the pots, as if they were the women at work. Spider at once ran and wakened his cousin, saying, "Quick, it is time to start." His cousin, however, saw he had been tricked, and went back to bed again, saying he would not start till the women were sweeping. No sooner was he asleep again than Spider made his children take brooms and begin to sweep very noisily. He roused Kofi once more, saying, "It is time we had started." Once more, his cousin refused to set off, saying it was only another trick of Spider's. He again returned to bed and to sleep. This time, Spider slipped into his cousin's room and cut a hole in the bottom of his bag, which he then filled with ashes. After that, he went off and left Kofi in peace. When morning came, the cousin awoke. Seeing no sign of Spider, he very gladly set off alone to the forest, thinking he had got rid of the tiresome fellow. He was no sooner seated by the stone, however, than Anansi appeared, having followed him by the trail of ashes. "Aha!" he cried. "Here is plenty of food for all. No more need to starve." "Hush," said his cousin. "You must not shout here. The place is too wonderful. Sit down quietly and eat." They had a good meal, and Kofi prepared to return home with enough for his family. "No, no," cried Anansi. "I am going to take the stone." In vain did his friend try to overcome his greed. Anansi insisted on putting the stone on his head and setting out for the village. "Spider, Spider, put me down," said the stone. "The pig came and drank and went away. The antelope came and fed and went away. Spider, Spider, put me down." Spider, however, refused to listen. He carried the stone from village to village, selling flour, until his bag was full of money. He then set out for home. Having reached his hut, and feeling very tired, he prepared to put the stone down. But the stone refused to be moved from his head. It stuck fast there, and no efforts could displace it. The weight of it very soon grew too much for Anansi. and ground him down into small pieces, which were completely covered over by the stone. That is why we often find tiny spiders gathered together under large stones. Up at a place in the Vaj, in Gunsbronsdale, there lived once upon a time in the days of old a poor couple. They had many children, and two of the sons, who were about half grown up, had to be always roaming about the country begging. So it was that they were well known with all the highways and byways, and they also knew the shortcut into Hedale. It happened once that they wanted to get thither, but at the same time they heard that some falconers had built themselves a hut at Malay, and so they wished to kill two birds with one stone, and see the birds, and how they are taken, and so they took the cut across Longmoss. But you must know it was far on towards autumn, and so the milkmaids had all gone home from the sheilings, and they could neither get shelter nor food. Then they had to keep straight on for Hedale, but the path was a mere track, and when night fell they lost it, and worse still, they could not find the falconer's hut either. And before they knew where they were, they found themselves in the very depths of the forest. As soon as they saw they could not get on, they began to break boughs, lit a fire, and built themselves a bower of branches, for they had a hand axe with them. And after that they plucked heather and moss and made themselves a bed. So a little while after they had lain down, they heard something which sniffed and snuffed, so with its nose. Then the boys pricked up their ears and listened sharp to hear whether it were wild beasts or wood trolls. And just then something snuffed up the air louder than ever and said,
"There's a smell of Christian blood here."
At the same time they heard such a heavy footfall that the earth shook under it, and then they knew well enough the trolls must be about. "Heaven help us, what shall we do?" said the younger boy to his brother. "Oh, you must stand as you are under the fir, and be ready to take our bags and run away when you see them coming. As for me, I will take the hand axe," said the other. All at once they saw the trolls coming at them like mad, and they were so tall and stout. Their heads were just as high as the fir tops, but it was a good thing they had only one eye between them all three, and that they used turn and turn about. They had a hole in their foreheads in which they put it, and turned and twisted it with their hands. The one that went first, he must have it to see his way, and the others went behind and took hold of the first. "Take up the traps," said the elder of the boys, "but don't run away too far, but see how things go. As they carry their eyes so high aloft, they'll find it hard to see me when I get behind them." Yes, the brother ran before and the trolls after him. Meanwhile, the elder got behind them and chopped the hindmost troll with his axe on the ankle, so that the troll gave an awful shriek, and the foremost troll got so afraid he was all of a shake and dropped the eye. But the boy was not slow to snap it up. It was bigger than 2-quart pots put together, and so clear and bright that though it was pitch dark, everything was as clear as day as soon as he looked through it. When the trolls saw he had taken their eye and done one of them harm, they began to threaten him with all the evil in the world if he didn't give back the eye at once. "I don't care a farthing for trolls and threats," said the boy. "Now I've got 3 eyes to myself, and you 3 got none, and besides, 2 of you have to carry the third."
"If we don't get our eye back this minute, you shall be both turned to stocks and stones,"
screeched the trolls. But the boy thought things needn't go so fast. He was not afraid for witchcraft or hard words. If they didn't leave him in peace, he'd chop them all 3, so that they would have to creep and crawl along the earth like crabs. When the trolls heard that, they got still, more afraid, and began to use soft words. They begged so prettily that he would give them their eye back, and then he should have both gold and silver and all that he wished to ask. Yes, that seemed all very fine to the lad, But he must have the gold and silver first, and so he said, if one of them would go home and fetch as much gold and silver as would fill his and his brother's bags, and give them 2 good crossbows beside, they might have their eye, but he should keep it until they did what he said. The trolls were very put out, and said none of them could go when he hadn't his eye to see with. But all at once one of them began to bawl out for their goody, for you must know they had a goody between them all 3 as well as an eye. After a while an answer came from a knoll a long way off to the north. So the troll said she must come with 2 steel crossbows and 2 buckets full of gold and silver. And then it was not long, you may fancy, before she was there, and when she heard what had happened, she too began to threaten them with witchcraft. But the trolls got so afraid and begged her, beware of the little wasp, for she couldn't be sure he would not take away her eye too. So she threw them the crossbows, and the buckets, and the gold and the silver, and strode off to the knoll with the trolls. And since that time, no one has ever heard that the trolls have walked in Hedale Wood, snuffing after Christian blood. The Werewolf. In the reign of Egbert the Saxon, there dwelt in Britain a maiden named Iseult, who was beloved of all, both for her goodness and for her beauty. But though many a youth came wooing her, she loved Harold only, and to him she plighted her troth. Among the other youth of whom Iseult was beloved was Alfred, and he was sore angered that Iseult showed favor to Harold. So that one day Alfred said to Harold, "Is it right that old Siegfried should come from his grave and have Iseult to wife?" Then added he, "Prithee, good sir, why do you turn so white when I speak your grandsire's name?" Then Harold asked, "What know you of Siegfried, that you taunt me? What memory of him should vex me now?" "We know, and we know," retorted Alfred. "There are some tales told us by our grandmas we have not forgot." So ever after that Alfred's words and Alfred's bitter smile haunted Harold by day and night. Harold's grandsire, Siegfried the Teuton, had been a man of cruel violence. The legend said that a curse rested upon him, and that at certain times he was possessed of an evil spirit that wreaked its fury on mankind. But Siegfried had been dead full many years, and there was not to mind the world of him save the legend and a cunning wrought spear which he had from Brunhilda the witch. This spear was such a weapon that it never lost its brightness, nor had its point been blunted. It hung in Harold's chamber, and it was the marvel among weapons of that time. Iseult knew that Alfred loved her, but she did not know of the bitter words which Alfred had spoke to Harold. Her love for Harold was perfect in its trust and gentleness, but Alfred had hit the truth. The curse of old Siegfried was upon Harold. Slumbering a century, it had awakened in the blood of the grandson, and Harold knew the curse that was upon him. And it was this that seemed to stand between him and Iseult, but love is stronger than all else, and Harold loved. Harold did not tell Iseult of the curse that was upon him, for he feared that she would not love him if she knew. Whensoever he felt the fire of the curse burning in his veins, he would say to her, "Tomorrow I hunt the wild boar in the uttermost forest," or "Next week I go stag stalking among the distant northern hills." Even so it was that he ever made good excuse for his absence, and Iseult thought no evil things, for she was trustful. Aye, though he went many times away and was long gone, Iseult suspected no wrong, so none beheld Harold when the curse was upon him in its violence. Alfred alone bethought himself of evil things. "'Tis passing strange," quoth he, "that ever and anon this gallant lover should quit our company, and betake himself whither none knoweth. In sooth, 'twill be well to have an eye on old Siegfried's grandson." Harold knew that Alfred watched him zealously, and he was tormented by the constant fear that Alfred would discover the curse that was on him. But what gave him greater anguish was the fear that mayhap at some moment when he was in Isolde's presence, the curse would seize upon him, and cause him to do great evil unto her, whereby she would be destroyed or her love for him would be undone forever. So Harold lived in terror, feeling that his love was hopeless, yet knowing not how to combat it. Now it befell in those times that the country round about was ravaged of a werewolf, a creature that was feared by all men, however so valorous. This werewolf was by day a man, but by night a wolf given to ravage and to slaughter, and having a charmed life against which no human agency availed aught. Wheresoever he went, he attacked and devoured mankind, spreading terror and desolation round about, and the dream reader said that the earth would not be freed from the werewolf until some man offered himself a voluntary sacrifice to the monster's rage. Now, although Harold was known far and wide as a mighty huntsman, he had never set forth to hunt the werewolf, and stranger now, the werewolf never ravaged the domain while Harold was therein. Whereat Alfred marveled much, and oftentimes he said, "Our Harold is a wondrous huntsman, who is like unto him in stalking the timid doe and in crippling the fleeing boar. But how passing well doth he time his absence from the haunts of the werewolf. Such valor beseemeth our young Siegfried." Which being brought to Harold, his heart flamed with anger, but he made no answer, lest he should betray the truth he feared. It happened so about that time that Isolde said to Harold, "Wilt thou go with me tomorrow even to the feast in the sacred grove?" "That can I not do," answered Harold. "I am privily summoned hence to Normandy upon a mission of which I shall some time tell thee, and I pray thee, on thy love for me, go not to the feast in the sacred grove without me." "What sayest thou?" cried Isolde. "Shall I not go to the feast of St. Alfreda? My father would be sore displeased were I not there with the other maidens. 'Twere greatest pity that I should despite his love thus." "But do not, I beseech thee," Harold implored. "Go not to the feast of St. Alfreda in the sacred grove. And thou would thus love me, go not. See thou my life, on my 2 knees I ask it." "How pale thou art," said Isolde, and trembling. "Go not to the sacred grove upon the morrow night," he begged. Isolde marveled at his acts and at his speech. Then for the first time she thought him to be jealous, whereat she secretly rejoiced. "Ah," quoth she, "thou dost doubt my love?" But when she saw a look of pain come on his face, she added, as if she repented of the words she had spoken, "Or dost thou fear the werewolf?" Then Harold answered, fixing his eyes on her, "Thou hast said it. It is the werewolf that I fear." "Why dost thou look at me so strangely, Harold?" cried Isolde. "By the cruel light in thine eyes, one might almost take thee to be the werewolf." "Come hither, sit beside me," said Harold tremblingly, "and I will tell thee why I fear to have thee go to the feast of St. Alfreda tomorrow evening. Hear what I dreamed last night. I dreamed I was the werewolf. Do not shudder, dear love, for 'twas only a dream. A grizzled old man stood at my bedside and strove to pluck my soul from my bosom. 'What wouldest thou?' I cried. 'Thy soul is mine,' he said. 'Thou shalt live out my curse. Give me thy soul. Hold back thy hands. Give me thy soul, I say.' 'Thy curse shall not be upon me,' I cried. 'What have I done that thy curse should rest upon me? Thou shalt not have my soul. For my offense shalt thou suffer, and in my curse thou shalt endure hell. It is so decreed.' So spake the old man, and he strove with me, and he prevailed against me, and he plucked my soul from my bosom, and he said, 'Go, search and kill.' And lo, I was a wolf upon the moor. The dry grass crackled beneath my tread. The darkness of the night was heavy and it oppressed me. Strange horrors tortured my soul, and it groaned and groaned, galed in that wolfish body. The wind whispered to me. With its myriad of voices, it spake to me and said, 'Go, search, and kill.' and above these voices sounded the hideous laughter of an old man. I fled the more, whether I knew not, nor knew of what motive lashed me on. I came to a river, and I plunged in. A burning thirst consumed me, and I lapped the waters of the river. They were waves of flame, and they flashed around me and hissed, and what they said was, "Go, search, and kill," and I heard the old man's laughter again. A forest lay before me with its gloomy thickets and its somber shadows, with its ravens, its vampires, its serpents, its reptiles, and all its hideous brood of night. I darted among its thorns and crouched amid the leaves, the nettles and the brambles. The owls hooted at me, and the thorns pierced my flesh. "Go, search, and kill," said everything. The hares sprang from my pathway. The other beasts ran bellowing away. Every form of the life shrieked in my ears. The curse was on me. I was the werewolf. On I went with the fleetness of the wind, and my soul groaned in its wolfish prison. And the winds of the waters and the trees bade me, "Go, search, and kill. Thou accursed brute, go, search, and kill." Nowhere was there pity for the wolf. What mercy thus should I, the werewolf, show? The curse was on me, and it filled me with a hunger and a thirst for blood. Skulking on my way within myself, I cried, "Let me have blood, oh, let me have human blood, that this wraith may be appeased, that this curse may be removed." At last I came to the sacred grove. Somber loomed the poplars. The oaks frowned upon me. Before me stood an old man. 'Twas he, grislied and taunting, whose curse I bore. He feared me not. All other living things fled before me, but the old man feared me not. A maiden stood beside him. She did not see me, for she was blind. "Kill, kill," cried the old man, and he pointed at the girl beside him. Hell raged within me. The curse impelled me. I sprang at her throat. I heard the old man's laughter once more, and then I awoke, trembling, cold, horrified. Scarce was this dream told when Alfred strolled that way. "Now, my lady," quoth he, "I bethink me never to have seen a sourer twain." Then Iseult told him of Harold's going away, and how that Harold had besought her not to venture to the feast of St. Elfrida in the sacred grove. "These fears are childish," cried Alfred boastfully. "And thou sufferest me, sweet lady. I will bear thee company to the feast, and a score of my lusty yeomen, with their good ye-bows and honest spears, they shall attend me. There be no werewolf, I trow, will chance about with us." Whereat Iseult laughed merrily, and Harold said, "'Twas well thou shalt go to the sacred grove, and may my love and heaven's grace forfend all evil." Then Harold went to his abode, and he fetched old Siegfried's spear back unto Iseult, and he gave it into her 2 hands, saying, "Take this spear with thee to the feast tomorrow night. It is old Siegfried's spear, possessing mighty virtue and marvelous." And Harold took Iseult to his heart and blessed her, and he kissed her upon her brow and upon her lips, saying, "Farewell, O my beloved. How wilt thou love me when thou knowest my sacrifice? Farewell, farewell forever, O dearest mine." So Harold went his way, and Iseult was lost in wonderment. On the morrow night came Iseult to the sacred grove, wherein the feast was spread, and she bore old Siegfried's spear with her in her girdle. Alfred attended her, and a score of lusty yeomen were with him. In the grove there was a great merriment, and was singing and dancing and games. Withal did the honest folk celebrate the feast of the fair Saint Elfrida. But suddenly a mighty tumult arose, and there were cries of, "The werewolf! The werewolf!" Terror seized upon all. Stout hearts were frozen with fear. Out from the further forest rushed the werewolf, wood-wroth, bellowing hoarsely, gnashing his fangs and tossing hither and thither the yellow foam from his snapping jaws. He sought Iseult straight, as if an evil power drew him to the spot where she stood, but Iseult was not afeared. Like a marble statue, she stood and saw the werewolf's coming. The yeomen dropped their torches and, casting aside their bows, had fled. Alfred alone abided there to do the monster battle. At the approaching wolf, he hurled his heavy lance, but as it struck the werewolf's bristling back, the weapon was all too shivered. Then the werewolf, fixing his eyes upon Yseult, skulked for a moment in the shadow of the yews, and thinking then of Harold's words, Yseult plucked old Siegfried's spear from her girdle, raised it on high, and with the strength of despair sent it hurtling through the air. The werewolf saw the shining weapon, and a cry burst from its gaping throat, a cry of human agony. And Yseult saw in the werewolf's eyes the eyes of someone she had seen and known, but 'twas for an instant only, and then the eyes were no longer human, but wolfish in their ferocity. A supernatural force seemed to speed the spear in its flight. With fearful precision, the weapon smote home and buried itself by half its length in the werewolf's shaggy breast, just above the heart, and then with a monstrous sigh, as if he yielded up his life without regret, the werewolf fell dead in the shadow of the yews. Then in very truth there was great joy, and loud were the acclaims, while, beautiful in her trembling pallor, Yseult was led unto her home, where the people set about to give great feasts to do her homage, for the werewolf was dead, and she it was that had slain him. But Yseult cried out, "Go search for Harold, go bring him to me, nor eat nor sleep till he be found." "Good my lady," quoth Alfred, "how can that be, since he hath betaken himself to Normandy?" "I care not where he be," she cried. "My heart stands still until I look into his eyes again." "Surely he hath not gone to Normandy," outspake Hubert. "This very eventide I saw him enter his abode." They hastened thither, a vast company. His chamber door was barred. "Harold, Harold, come forth!" they cried, as they beat upon the door, but no answer came to their calls and knockings. Afeared, they battered down the door, and when it fell, they saw that Harold lay upon his bed. "He sleeps," said one. "See, he holds a portrait in his hand, and it is her portrait. How fair he is, and how tranquilly he sleeps." But no, Harold was not asleep. His face was calm and beautiful, as if he dreamed of his beloved. But his raiment was red with the blood that streamed from a wound in his breast, a gaping, ghastly spear wound just above his heart. The Goblin City. Long, long ago in the island of Crelon, there was a large city full of nothing but goblins. They were all she-goblins too, and if they wanted husbands, they used to get hold of travelers and force them to marry, and afterwards, when they were tired of their husbands, they gobbled them up. One day, a ship was wrecked upon the coast near the Goblin City, and 500 sailors were cast ashore. The she-goblins came down to the seashore and brought food and dry clothes for the sailors, and invited them to come into the city. There was nobody else there at all, but for fear that the sailors should be frightened away, the goblins by their magic power made shapes of people appear all around, so that there seemed to be men plowing in the fields, or shepherds tending their sheep, and huntsmen with hounds, and all the sights of the quiet country life. So when the sailors looked round and saw everything as usual, they felt quite secure, although, as you know, it was all a sham. The end of it was that they persuaded the sailors to marry them, telling them that their own husbands had gone to sea in a ship, and had been gone these 3 years, so that they must be drowned and lost forever. But really, as you know, they had served others in just the same way, and their last batch of husbands were then in prison waiting to be eaten. In the middle of the night, when the men were all asleep, the she-goblins rose up, put on their hats, and hurried down to the prison. There they killed a few men and gnawed their flesh, and ate them up, and after this feast they went home again. It so happened that the captain of the sailors woke up before his wife came home, and not seeing her there, he watched. by and by in she came. He pretended to be asleep and looked out of the tail of his eye. She was still munching and crunching, and as she munched, she muttered, men's meat, that's what goblins like to eat. She said it over and over again, then lay down, and soon she was snoring loudly. The captain was horribly frightened to find out he had married a goblin. What was he to do? They could not fight with goblins, and they were in the goblins' power. If they had a ship, they might have sailed away, because goblins hate the water worse than a cat. But their ship was gone. He could think of nothing. However, next morning he found a chance of telling his mates what he had discovered. Some of them believed him, and some said he must have been dreaming. They were sure their wives would not do such a thing. Those who believed him agreed that they would look out for a chance of escape. But there was a kind fairy who hated those goblins, and she was determined to save the men. So she told her flying horse to go and carry them away, and accordingly, as the men were out for a walk next day, the captain saw in the air a beautiful horse with large white and gold wings. The horse fluttered down and hovered just above them, crying out in a human voice, "Who wants to go home?" I do, called out the sailors. "Climb up then," said the horse, dropping within reach. So one climbed up, and then another, and although the horse looked no bigger than any other horse, there was room for everybody on his back. I think that somehow, when they got up, the fairy made them shrink small till they were no bigger than so many ants, and thus there was plenty of room for all. When all who wanted to go had got up on his back, away flew the beautiful horse and took them safely home. As for those who remained behind, that very night the goblins set upon them and mangled them and munched them to mince meat. Supernatural forces. Introduction. Ireland has a long folkloric history involving witches, ghosts, and enchantment. Whether it's bewitched domestic items, people being transformed into animals or objects, or spooky visitations from beyond the grave, the idea of supernatural help or hindrance is a common theme in fairy tale storytelling. Often the purposes or morality of such interference is beyond our control or understanding, making the stories sometimes frightening and often entertaining, as in the memorable examples gathered here. Bewitched Butter. Not far from Ruthmallen lived, last spring, a family called Hanlon, and in a farmhouse some fields distant, people named Dougherty. Both families had good cows, but the Hanlons were fortunate in possessing a Kerry cow that gave more milk and yellower butter than the others. Grace Dougherty, a young girl who was more admired than loved in the neighborhood, took much interest in the Kerry cow and appeared one night at Mrs. Hanlon's door with a modest request. "Will you let me milk your Molly cow?" "And why would you wish to milk my Molly, Grace dear?" inquired Mrs. Hanlon. "Oh, just because you are sore at the present time." "Thank you kindly, Grace, but I'm not too sore to do my own work. I'll no trouble you to milk." The girl turned away with a discontented air, but the next evening, and the next, found her at the cowhouse door with the same request. At length Mrs. Hanlon, not knowing well how to persist in her refusal, yielded and permitted Grace to milk the Kerry cow. She soon had reason to regret her want of firmness. Molly gave no more milk to her owner. When this melancholy state of things lasted for 3 days, the Hanlons applied to a certain Mark McCarrion, who lived near Binyon. "That cow has been milked by someone with an evil eye," said he. "Will she give you a wee drop, do you think? The full of a pint measure, would you?" "Oh, aye, Mark dear, I'll get that much milk from her anyway." "Well, Mrs. Hanlon, lock the door, and get 9 new pins that were never used in clothes, and put them in a saucepan with a pint of milk. Set them on the fire and let them come to the boil. The 9 pins soon began to simmer in Molly's milk. Rapid steps were heard approaching the door, agitated knocks followed, and Grace Dougherty's high-toned voice was raised in eager entreaty. "Let me in, Mrs. Hunlan," she cried. "Take off that cruel pot. Take out them pins, for they're pricking holes in my heart, and I'll never offer to touch milk of yours again." The Horned Women. A rich woman sat up late one night carding and preparing wool while all the family and servants were asleep. Suddenly, a knock was given at the door, and a voice called out, "Open, open." "Who is there?" said the woman of the house. "I am the witch of the one horn," was answered. The mistress, supposing that one of her neighbors had called and required assistance, opened the door, and a woman entered, having in her hand a pair of wool carders, and bearing a horn on her forehead, as if growing there. She sat down by the fire in silence, and began to card the wool with violent haste. Suddenly she paused, and said aloud, "Where are the women? They delay too long." Then a second knock came to the door, and a voice called as before, "Open, open." The mistress felt herself constrained to rise and open to the call, and immediately a second witch entered, having 2 horns on her forehead, and in her hand a wheel for spinning wool. "Give me place," she said. "I am the witch of the 2 horns," and she began to spin as quick as lightning. And so the knocks went on, and the call was heard, and the witches entered, until at last 12 women sat round the fire, the first with 1 horn, the last with 12 horns. And they carded the thread, and turned their spinning wheels, and wound and wove, all singing together an ancient rhyme, but no words did they speak to the mistress of the house. Strange to hear and frightful to look upon were these 12 women, with their horns and their wheels, and the mistress felt near to death, and she tried to rise that she might call for help, but she could not move, nor could she utter a word or a cry, for the spell of the witches was upon her. Then one of them called to her in Irish and said, "Rise, woman, and make us a cake." Then the mistress searched for a vessel to bring water from the well, that she might mix the meal and make the cake, but she could find none. And they said to her, "Take a sieve and bring water in it." And she took the sieve and went to the well, but the water poured from it, and she could fetch none for the cake. And she sat down by the well and wept. Then came a voice by her and said, "Take yellow clay and moss and bind them together and plaster the sieve so that it will hold." This she did, and the sieve held the water for the cake. And the voice said again, "Return, and when thou comest to the north angle of the house, cry aloud 3 times and say, 'The mountain of the Fennin women and the sky over it is all on fire.'" And she did so. When the witches inside heard the call, a great and terrible cry broke from their lips, and they rushed forth with wild lamentations and shrieks, and fled away to Slivamanon, where was their chief abode. But the spirit of the well bade the mistress of the house to enter and prepare her home against the enchantments of the witches, if they returned again. And first, to break their spells, she sprinkled the water in which she had washed her child's feet, the feet water, outside the door of the threshold. Secondly, she took the cake which the witches had made in her absence, of meal mixed with the blood drawn from the sleeping family, and she broke the cake in bits, and placed a bit in the mouth of each sleeper, and they were restored. And she took the cloth they had woven, and placed it half in and half out of the chest with the padlock. And lastly, she secured the door with a great crossbeam fastened in the jambs, so that they could not enter, and having done these things, she waited. Not long were the witches in coming, and they raged and called for vengeance. Open, open, they screamed. Open, Feetwater. I cannot, said the Feetwater. I am scattered on the ground, and my path is down to the law. Open, open, wooden trees and beams. They cried to the door. I cannot, said the door, for the beam is fixed on the jambs, and I have no power to move. Open, open, cake that we have made and mingled with blood. They cried again. I cannot, said the cake, for I am broken and bruised, and my blood is on the lips of the sleeping children. Then the witches rushed through the air with great cries, and fled back to Slimon, uttering strange curses on the spirit of the well, who had wished their ruin. But the woman in the house was left in peace, and a mantle dropped by one of the witches was kept hung up by the mistress as a sign of the night's awful contest. And this mantle was in possession of the same family for generation to generation for 500 years after. And thank you so much for joining me and being a part of the Luxy family. And I hope you have enjoyed all of these scary stories throughout the year. And I can't wait till next year and to continue this journey and to share more scary, spooky tales with you. So, if you would like to follow me on any of my other social medias, there'll be a link in the description down below. And please don't forget to slay, subscribe, like, and always be yourself. And we always love to be spooky over here. And remember, I am the afterlife of the party, but I would love for you to join me in the afterlife of the party. And the easiest and best way to do that is to come and join me on my Patreon. And you can see on the screen a shout out to all of my wonderful members on my Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me and being a part of my Patreon family. And a special shout out to my Ultimate Luxes. So thank you so much to Chris Bruner and to Bishop. Thank you for being Ultimate Luxes with me. And once again, Happy New Year. I hope we all have a wonderful 2025. We've had such a crazy year this year in 2024. I know we've all had rocky times, there's been rough times. Yes, there's always been good times. I mean, we can't do anything without at least having some good to balance out the bad. But here's hoping that 2025 is our year and that things start looking up and becoming amazing. So, Happy New Year, and I wish nothing but happiness and beautiful, wonderful things coming your way. So, once again, thank you so much for being here with me for scary stories my father told me, or just being here for Luxy Charms or Charsie Chats, whatever I have going on in my life. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And once again, Happy New Year.